My wife asked if she could go home with another man, but my answer left her frozen. Of course. And you don't have to come back. I left with a broken heart, but my dignity intact. She hadn't expected me to release her so quickly from the commitment we'd sworn together. In the days that followed, she discovered that the other man didn't want commitment, just the moment. She was left alone, facing the reflection of her own mistake. I, little by little, rebuilt my life and found a new love, someone who offers me respect, truth, and peace. When we met again, she wanted to talk about the past, but I was blunt. I forgave her, not for her sake, but for my own. I don't carry any resentment, but I'm not going back either. We went our separate ways, she with regret, I with a fresh start. I remember exactly how she said it, as if she were asking permission to buy a dress or go out with a friend. Would you mind if I went home with him tonight? With him. And she didn't even bother to disguise the pronoun, to disguise her intention. My stomach churned, but my voice was out before my heart could grasp what was happening. Of course. And you don't have to come back. The silence afterward hurt more than any scream. She looked at me as if expecting something else, maybe a plea, a scandal, maybe the humiliation that would make it easier for her to leave me. But there was no drama. Just a man torn apart inside, trying to hold together what little he had left of himself. And in that moment, even before she walked out the door with him, I already knew, she would never be mine again. But what she didn't yet know was that, after that night, she would never be whole again, either. The pain of betrayal comes not only from the breakup, but from the knowledge that someone who looked you in the eyes so many times with, "I love you," on their lips, now does the same to someone else. The same look, the same smile, the same touch. And we wonder, at what point did love begin to die and we didn't notice? Was it in the silence of conversationless dinners? On a cell phone turned upside down? In kisses given out of habit, not desire? Or was it when love was still alive, but she chose to kill it? I wasn't betrayed just physically. I was betrayed in the story we built, in the plans we made, in the house we decorated together, in the lazy Sundays we spent watching series I can no longer watch. She didn't just leave me, she ripped away the very ground where my feelings were planted. And the cruelest part? She didn't leave crying, regretful. She left smiling, thinking she was moving towards something better. As if I had become insufficient, obsolete, like a book that has already been read and now rests on a dusty shelf. But time, that unhurried old man, showed me that dignity is not negotiable. That as much as it hurts to let someone go, it hurts even more to stay where you're not loved. And so, slowly, I began to rebuild myself. The first night sleeping alone felt like an eternity. Breakfast without the two mugs side by side hurt like a knife. The silence of the house echoed the sound of absence. But little by little, I filled the empty spaces with self-respect. With good memories that I could still hold on to without them tearing me apart. I began to look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed of having been betrayed. The shame wasn't mine. It was hers. Meanwhile, she discovered that the other man wasn't a prince, he was just a visitor. An emotional tourist, who passed through her life seeking warmth, not shelter. She wanted a movie-like passion, but ended up with a cut scene. And when she tried to look back, I was already too far away. Far away in time, far away in affection. I was no longer hers, not even in her memory. When she came back to me, it wasn't with arrogance. She came with the weary look of someone who had finally understood what she'd lost. She wanted to talk. To say she was sorry, that she'd been confused, that she'd been weak. Perhaps she expected me to hug her, to tell her that love conquers all. But what she found was a man who had learned to love himself more than he needed to be loved by others. I forgave her. Not for her. For me. Because holding a grudge is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I needed to move on. She wanted to come back, but the time she used to lose herself, I used to find myself again. And there, before her, I was honest. I said everything I needed to say, not with anger, but with the serenity of someone who no longer belongs to that past. I don't carry resentment, but I'm not going back either. And I could see in her eyes the exact moment the penny dropped. When she realized the love she had was true. That the man she traded for empty promises was the only one who truly loved her completely. But it was too late. Because sometimes, regret isn't enough. Love has an expiration date when it's betrayed. She said goodbye without knowing it would be her last goodbye. She left carrying on her shoulders the weight of a bad choice, and in her heart, the absence of a love she'll never find again. I stayed. But not like someone who remains trapped in the past. I stayed where I was safe, whole, at peace. And in that peace, I found someone. Someone who doesn't need convincing to stay. Who doesn't compare, who doesn't hide, who doesn't need to lie to live by my side. Someone who arrived when I no longer expected it. And with her, I learned that true love is the kind that gives rest, not tension. It's funny how time reveals the truths hidden in passion. How the silence of an absence can scream louder than 1,000 false statements. She wanted to live an adventure and discovered that adventures end. I wanted to build a story. And now, I'm writing a new one. With another woman, different plans, and the same truth, I deserve to be loved with respect. But you know what hurts most about all this? It wasn't being betrayed. It wasn't being replaced. It was knowing that, even if she regrets it every day of her life, there's nothing she can do to turn back the clock. And perhaps the cruelest punishment isn't being abandoned. But realizing, too late, that you were the love of someone's life, and lost it. And the most surprising part of this story is yet to come. Because on the day she thought she could just show up at my wedding, like someone knocking on the door of a dormant past, she discovered what it's like to look into someone's eyes and see that the love is still there, but it's not for you anymore. She smiled, expecting to be welcomed, but found a look that said, "You're too late." And what happened next, no one there was prepared for. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not romanticized, nor justified. The stories you will hear are fiction, but the feelings, those are real. The objective is clear, to show how betrayal erodes trust, destroys homes and leaves scars that time cannot erase. Prepare yourself. What comes next is a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. Good story. They met on a warm September afternoon, the kind when the wind seems to push fate harder, and chance acts as if it had rehearsed every step so that two lives would collide at just the right moment. She wore a sweater too thin for the season, but she wore it with a lightness that made it seem like a part of herself. He, distracted by a book barely held in his hand, nearly spilled her coffee on the sidewalk when they bumped into each other for the first time. They both apologized at the same time and smiled so naturally it seemed they'd known each other for a long time. There was nothing extraordinary about the scene, except for what happened inside each of them, that inner silence that precedes great changes, when the heart understands what the mind doesn't even suspect yet. His name was Michael, a man with a calm voice, an attentive gaze, and a patience that seemed to have been honed through many frustrations. He wasn't exactly handsome in the obvious sense of the word, but he carried a serene, almost magnetic presence, like someone who listens more than he speaks and understands more than he says. He worked in graphic design, spending hours in front of the computer creating projects that blended art and logic, and had a sincere love for simple things, jazz in the late afternoon, warm bread with butter in the morning, and smiles that demand no explanation. He never had many loves. Perhaps out of fear of giving too much of himself, perhaps because he knew that giving oneself completely requires a trust that isn't built overnight. Her name was Emma. She had large, expressive eyes, the kind that seemed to capture everything around her with an almost uncomfortable intensity. There was a constant restlessness about her, a desire for more, to live deeply, as if she feared time would pass and she hadn't experienced all that life had to offer. She worked as a freelance photographer, jumping from project to project with the same hunger with which she devoured books and experiences. It was difficult to define her. There were days when she seemed light as a breeze, others when she retreated into herself as if needing silence to reorganize her own chaos. But when she smiled, for real, the world seemed to make sense for a few seconds. Their relationship began as almost all do, messages exchanged without much pretense, meetings that became less frequent, and that strange feeling of absence when one of them took too long to respond. Over time, the conversations became longer, the silences more comfortable, and the goodbyes more difficult. Michael and Emma seemed to fit where the others had failed. He offered stability, she stirred movement. He was grounding, she was wind. And somehow, it worked. They rented a small apartment together after a year and a half of dating. It was modest, but full of personality. The walls didn't match, one was petrol blue, another white, another with a bookshelf that took up half the living room, and that said a lot about them both. Michael was organized, methodical, had schedules, routines, a plan for each day of the week. Emma was chaos with charm. She'd leave a wet towel on the bed, forget the light on in the kitchen, but she had the sensitivity to sense when he was too quiet. And in those moments, she'd pull him to the couch, lie on his lap, and whisper that she loved him. And he believed her. Because she made it seem true. And maybe it was. At least in that moment. The differences between them, which once fueled their enchantment, over time began to become small frictions. Nothing too serious, at least not at first glance. Just the natural wear and tear of those who live so closely together. She wanted to travel more, he wanted to save. She wanted to move to a bigger place, but he still didn't feel ready. He enjoyed quiet nights at home, she missed parties, friends, the adrenaline of late nights filled with music. But still, they always came back to each other at the end of the day. Because, despite the tensions, there was love. There was care. And, most importantly, there was the belief, from both of them, that their relationship had something special. Something worth preserving. Weekends were their refuge. They had a tradition. Saturday was breakfast at the bakery on the corner, the one with the iron tables and the lady who always served the same cinnamon roll. Sunday was movie day on the couch, sharing a blanket and fighting over the remote control. In these small routines, they seemed happy. Or at least, content. They weren't the most passionate couple in the world, but there was tenderness in their gestures, respect in their disagreements, and an almost comfortable sense of permanence. Their closest friends commented that they seemed made for each other. And perhaps because of that, Michael never questioned Emma's longer silences. He never pressed her when she said she needed time alone or when she went out with friends and came back late, with that sweet perfume on her neck. He believed in her. And more than that, he believed that trust was a choice. And he chose trust. Emma, on the other hand, was going through a more turbulent time internally. She was beginning to feel a restlessness she couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly dissatisfaction with Michael, but a kind of longing for herself. Sometimes she found herself staring at the ceiling in her bedroom, trying to remember the last time she felt something new. Something that made her heart race. The routine, which had once comforted her, now oppressed her. The love was still there, but it was a tamed, measured love, surrounded by promises and obligations. And she, so driven by sensations, was beginning to doubt whether she could live with so little risk. Michael noticed she was different, but he didn't know how to approach her without seeming controlling. He opted for small gestures. He'd leave coffee ready for her in the morning, even when he left early. He'd stock the fridge with her favorite sweets. He'd buy her flowers for no reason, as he had in the first few months. And she'd smile. She'd thank him. She'd kiss him gently. But something in her eyes had changed. A less intense glow, a less complete presence. As if part of her was always elsewhere. The days continued to pass, and from the outside, they still seemed like a normal couple. They argued over trivial things, made up, cooked together, watched TV shows. But there was something silently accumulating between them, like dust settling in corners where the light doesn't shine. A feeling that wasn't always named, but it was there, the sensation that something had been lost along the way, and no one knew exactly when it happened. Michael tried to rekindle the romance. He planned a surprise trip for her birthday. He booked a cozy cabin in a nearby town, with a fireplace and trails through the woods. She appreciated the gesture and was touched, but her joy was shorter-lived than he expected. She seemed distracted, distant, as if she were only there in person. Still, he persisted. He believed that love was something that was watered every day. That difficult times passed. That the important thing was not to give up. Emma was caught between the affection she felt for him and the confusion growing inside her. She didn't want to hurt him. But she also didn't know how to silence what her soul screamed. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that maybe it was just fatigue, or some kind of emptiness that would soon pass. But the truth is, what she felt wasn't a lack of love. It was a lack of air. And when the lack of air becomes routine, affection alone is no longer enough to keep someone there. The relationship continued, sustained more by the strength of history than by the passion of the present. And both, silently, kept trying. Because there were still good times. Genuine laughter. Tight hugs. Memories that seemed to glue together the loose pieces of the present. But what neither knew was that love, no matter how strong, cannot survive without presence. And that sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't the end. It's the end happening while no one is paying attention. And it was precisely in this terrain of neglect and absence that the storyline began to fold in on itself. No scandals, no obvious signs. Just the slow erosion of a love that, little by little, was no longer enough for just one side. But what neither of them imagined, at that moment, was how much this would still hurt. And how the current silence would soon turn into the most devastating storm they had ever faced. Night had fallen like a weight on Michael's shoulders. The wind blew coldly through the cracks in the window, and the distant sound of rain began to touch the roof with a sad cadence, as if time had decided to match what was happening inside him. Emma was taking longer than usual to return, and something inside him, something he'd always pushed to the back burner, began to pulse strangely, restlessly. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't insecurity, it was an ancient, almost animal intuition that made him check his watch and feel his chest tighten with each passing minute. He tried to distract himself, tidying his desk, opening his computer, shuffling through his files, but his concentration slipped. When he finally heard the sound of the key turning in the lock, a brief relief washed over him, but it was a relief that lasted only as long as he saw her enter. She was different. Her hair was disheveled, her gaze distant, her body present and her soul elsewhere. He didn't ask anything right away, just watched. Emma forced a smile, that practiced smile of someone trying to hide their own confusion, and said something banal about the traffic, the weather, anything that would distract them. Michael responded with a serenity that hid the turmoil beginning to form within him. For a moment, she thought he would believe her. That once again he would choose to trust. But this time, there was something in his gaze, a lucidity that hurt. That night, dinner remained untouched. They sat at the table, the sound of silverware echoing like a frustrated attempt at normalcy. Emma picked at her food without actually eating, and he watched every gesture, every hesitation. Until he couldn't take it anymore. "Are you happy?" he asked suddenly, his voice calm, almost low, but firm enough to cut through the air. She took a moment to answer. She feigned surprise, but her eyes betrayed her. "Of course I am, why ask that?" He took a deep breath, looked away, and for a moment he wanted to believe again, wanted to pretend nothing was happening. But there was a truth screaming inside him. "Because I'm not. And I can't pretend anymore." The silence that fell was cruel. She lowered her eyes, absently stirring her fork, and that was enough. Michael felt his entire body go cold. It was the wordless confession. The kind of answer that doesn't need to be said. "There's someone, isn't there?" he asked, his voice trembling, trying not to show what he already knew. She stared at him, hesitated, opened her mouth, and closed it again. Tears came before the words. I didn't want it to be like this, she whispered, and the room seemed to shrink. He stood slowly, as if needing strength to stay upright. I didn't want it to be like this, but it was. You could have told me before you led me to believe there was still us. Emma tried to reach out, to touch his arm, but he backed away. Don't touch me now. His tone wasn't aggressive, it was sad, so sad that she flinched. He walked to the window, staring out as if searching in the dark for an explanation. I just need to understand why. Was it missing? Was it boredom? Was it what? Because I was here, Emma. I always was. She wept silently, trying to string together words that made sense, but everything that came out was fragmented. I lost myself, Michael. I don't know. I needed to feel alive again, I didn't want to hurt you, but... He interrupted her, his voice low, almost whispered. But it hurt. And now, what's left? The sound of the rain grew louder. It was as if the world outside was crying for them. Emma tried to explain, to talk about confusion, about need, about how she hadn't planned anything. But her excuses sounded hollow. He listened, but his heart no longer followed. The love was still there, but it was beginning to shatter into small, sharp pieces. With whom? He asked after a long silence. She hesitated, swallowed hard, and answered the name he'd only known until that moment as a studio colleague, someone she'd mentioned casually between projects. He felt the breath leave his body. It wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a coincidence. It was someone he'd greeted, talked to, exchanged jokes with. Betrayal had a face. Michael paced the room, trying to contain the explosively mixed anger and pain. So that was why. The departures, the silences, the blank stare. I should have understood. She tried to justify herself, but he held up his hand for silence. No, don't try to protect me now. There's nothing left to protect. Emma sobbed, saying she still loved him, that she regretted it, that the other man didn't mean the same. But her words now seemed to echo in an empty room. He took a deep breath, his eyes welling, and responded in a tone so calm it made her shiver. Loving someone and betraying them don't coexist, Emma. Choosing the other man was your way of saying I wasn't enough anymore. And I understand. You just can't keep pretending there's still an us. The silence that followed was heavy. She tried to move closer again, but he just stepped back and grabbed his coat. Where are you going? She asked desperately. He looked at her and said, with a sharp calm, far enough away so I won't see you fall apart over what you chose. Emma fell onto the couch, her face in her hands, her body racked with tears. He opened the door and stood there for a second, staring at the floor, as if a part of him still wanted to return, but the rest had already left. And then he left. The door closed with a loud bang that echoed louder than any scream. In the days that followed, the house became a mirror of emptiness. The plants wilted, the windows remained closed, the air heavy with memories that no longer comforted her. Emma tried calling, texting, begging for a conversation, but Michael didn't respond. He fell completely silent, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say. As time passed, she began to realize the true weight of the choice she had made. The other, the man for whom she had risked everything, seemed increasingly distant. He spoke of no future, promised nothing. He was too light, too temporary, and when she began asking for more time, more presence, more meaning, he simply disappeared. Emma was left alone with her own mistake, trying to rebuild what she had undone. She sought out Michael one last time, not to apologize, but to try to understand if there was any chance of a new beginning. He agreed to meet her at a cafe weeks later. She arrived first, nervous, her hands sweating, her heart racing. When he walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. His serene gaze, his firm posture, he was a different man. A man who had learned to move on. I needed to see you, she said, her voice almost broken. I know, he replied, sitting down calmly. Her words came rushing out. She spoke of regret, of emptiness, of the pain of realizing too late the value of what she had. He listened in silence, without interrupting. When she finished, he waited a few seconds before speaking. "Emma, I've forgiven you." Her eyes widened, confused. "You've forgiven me?" He nodded. "Yes. Because forgiveness is the only way to stop carrying what you did to me. But don't confuse forgiveness with payback. I'm not going back." She tried to take his hand, but he gently pulled away. "You taught me something. That love without respect becomes a wound. I don't want any more wounds." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he almost gave in. Almost. "Michael, I messed up, but I still love you," she said in a desperate whisper. He looked at her tenderly, but replied, "I loved you too. But now I love the peace I've found away from you." The words pierced the air like a sentence. Emma realized that was the end. There was no room for promises, no nostalgia. What had been between them was buried under the weight of her choice. And fate, which seems to delight in closing cycles in cruelly poetic ways, still had one more scene in store for her. Months later, at a wedding in a hall illuminated by hundreds of golden lights, Emma walked in unexpectedly. She didn't know what had brought her there, perhaps a last impulse of hope, perhaps the masochism of seeing what she had lost. When she saw him at the altar, hand in hand with another woman, her heart broke completely. He looked radiant, serene, whole. And when their eyes met, he smiled. Not a smile of love, but of farewell. In that moment, Emma understood that the most painful punishment isn't being abandoned. It's watching, helpless, as someone loves another the way they once loved you. She applauded the kiss that sealed his new beginning, and amid the applause, she felt silent tears fall. The world spun, people smiled, but inside her, everything was falling apart. Love, he realized too late, doesn't die when it's gone. It dies when it's betrayed. And when it dies like that, there's no resurrection possible. Time followed its course like an inevitable current, taking with it the remnants of what had once been a home. After the wedding, Michael never heard directly from Emma again. The messages stopped, the phone calls ceased, and her name no longer occupied any space in his conversations or active memories. He had made the necessary effort to free himself completely. Not only from the bonds, but also from the pain, the hurt, and especially from the temptation to harbor any trace of guilt. He began to live lightly, without needing to look back. His new relationship flourished like a plant watered with patience and truth. There were no ghosts between them, no promises made out of obligation. The woman he married didn't complete him, she overflowed him. Michael learned that true love isn't the kind that traps us in a story, but the kind that teaches us that being loved in a healthy way isn't a luxury, it's a right. Emma, on this side of time, carried an absence that no other man, place, or experience could fill. After Michael's marriage, her life plunged into a silence difficult to explain. It wasn't just loneliness, it was the feeling of being out of place in her own body. She woke every day with a memory that burned like an exposed scar, his gaze, firm and calm, telling her he wouldn't return. It destroyed her more than any scream could have. She tried to move on, but discovered that not everyone is cut out for easy new beginnings. Guilt accompanied her every gesture, every attempt to move on. She met other people, moved into other environments, but nothing truly fit. Not because no one was good enough, but because, deep down, she knew she had thrown away what many spend their entire lives trying to find. The lover, who had for a time offered her the illusion of freedom and excitement, disappeared from her life as if he'd never existed. She tried to contact him, sought answers, but he didn't even respond. There was no official breakup, no sincere conversation. Just the emptiness left by someone who never intended to stay. The pain of rejection wasn't just that of being left, but of realizing she'd been used, ignored, and replaced with the same coldness with which she'd abandoned Michael. The cruelest part was knowing that, while she agonized emotionally, Michael flourished in peace. And not out of revenge or vanity, but because he'd chosen to be happy. Years later, Emma became a solitary figure. She continued her photography, but now her images seemed charged with a more melancholic tone. She photographed couples and families with a touching sensitivity, but there was always something unsaid behind the lens. A longing for herself, for who she was before she destroyed the only thing that anchored her. During one of these sessions, she chanced upon a couple who were friends of Michael's. The conversation was brief and polite, but one phrase haunted her for weeks: "He's doing so well. You should have seen the peace he's found." This phrase repeated in her mind like a silent refrain, a soundtrack to a story she herself decided to end prematurely. Michael, for his part, didn't become bitter. He didn't spread his pain to others, he didn't close himself off to love. On the contrary, he transformed everything he experienced into maturity. He didn't need to recount his experiences to prove how much he had grown. He simply lived differently, with more presence, more gratitude, and more clarity about what he accepted and what he didn't in his life. His marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. His new wife knew exactly who he was and what he had suffered. And yet, she never made it a burden. She cared for him with ease, and he reciprocates. They built a family with solid foundations, created their own rituals, traveled, laughed, and cried together. There was truth there. There was root. Michael now understood that love doesn't survive on intense feelings that come and go, but rather on the daily choice to remain, even when it's easier to give up. One afternoon, many years later, Emma received an unexpected invitation. It was a photography exhibition organized by a group she admired. Another photographer had suggested her name, and she decided to accept. During the event, as she surveyed the works hanging on the walls, she saw a woman smiling in the distance, holding a small boy. The woman looked familiar, and for a moment, her heart skipped a beat. When the boy ran toward a man waiting near the door, Emma felt the ground disappear. It was Michael. He was there. More mature, more serene, with the same calm gaze, but now filled with a different light. The woman was his wife. And the boy, his son. Emma didn't know whether to hide, approach, or simply run away. She stood still, trying to hold back the tears that welled up without warning. Michael looked in her direction. For a second, their eyes met. He recognized her. But his face didn't change. He simply nodded politely, no smile, no judgment, just a simple gesture. And then he turned his attention to the woman and child. That scene said more than any conversation. He had left her in the past. Not with resentment, but with conviction. Forever. Emma left the gallery and walked through the streets, feeling the wind blow on her face as if each breath carried a fragment of what she had lost. She arrived home, took off her shoes, sat on her bed, and cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. Not with anger, not with longing, but with regret. A regret that doesn't seek redemption, only consumes. That night, she wrote a letter to herself. She wouldn't send it to anyone. It was simply an attempt to reorganize the guilt she would always carry. In the letter, she wrote a single sentence more than once: "I was the mistake of someone who only understood value after loss." Michael moved on with his life without ever looking back. When his children asked about the past, he spoke wisely. He didn't hide the pain, but he also didn't turn it into drama. He taught them that love is a two-way street, and that respect is its fuel. And without respect, no path will survive. The past became a harsh but necessary teacher. And he learned everything he needed to know to be the man he is today. Now that you've made it this far, I want to know, what did you think of this story? Share your honest opinion in the comments. Have you ever been through something like this? Do you know someone who has? Your insight can help others see the value of true love before it's too late. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now. Every week, new real, moving, and impactful stories like this await you here. This story shows us, starkly, how betrayal not only destroys a relationship but also tears away parts of the perpetrator. There is no guaranteed return. When you choose to betray, you also choose to bury a part of what was most pure. Cheating isn't just betraying the other person, it's betraying everything you've built, it's killing trust, it's turning love into a painful memory. No forgiveness can erase it, and no amount of time can rebuild it in the same way. May this story be a reminder that when you have something true, the greatest proof of maturity is choosing to care for it, not destroy it. And once again, we emphasize, this channel does not support, romanticize, or justify any kind of betrayal. Here, truth, respect, and love go hand in hand. Thank you for listening until the end.